So, hi, Paul, and welcome to SCOTONOMICS. So, you're a professor of agribusiness and economics at Lincoln University in Lincoln, in New Zealand, and a member of the Wellbeing Alliance. Could you tell our audience a little bit about your economic journey or your journey to being where you are today?
Okay, I tell people that my journey to be an economist started with my grandfather, who was born in Glasgow and came out as a young man to Dunedin in New Zealand. And he met my grandmother, they fell in love, they got married, and they conceived my father. And this was 1933. And 3 months later, my grandfather became unemployed at the height of the Great Depression. And he didn't have another full-time job for 6 years.
Wow.
And then in 1939, he did get a job. It was acting as a carpenter for the Centennial of New Zealand exhibition in Wellington, and the war broke out. And so he lost what money he had at that point and had to start again for the second time. So my father grew up without much to live on, and it was a struggle. He left school as early as he could to earn income for his family. And so when I finished my education, one of the big questions I wanted to answer was, how is it that the economy can be designed to better help people create lives that they value and have reason to value? And that's been my life journey.
Wow, yes, that's a great life journey. New Zealand government became a member of the Wellbeing Economy of Governments in 2018. Were you involved in that?
I wasn't directly, but there are 3 of us who are organising the Wellbeing Economy Alliance in New Zealand. And Susie is one of my colleagues. She was the New Zealand civil servant that was most closely involved in that initiative.
How has that changed the economy of New Zealand since then? What are the notable wins for you?
So the main win has been in 2 directions. One is about respecting planetary boundaries. So the climate emergency means that all of us has to get off our addiction to fossil fuels. And so the current government has stopped issuing licenses for offshore exploration of more oil and gas. And this is symbolic of a stronger commitment by the government to redesign the economy to stay within planetary boundaries. And then the second aspect is that New Zealand is a rich country. We are part of the OECD family of rich countries, but within the country, there's a lot of disparity. There are people who are enjoying good, comfortable, enriched lives, and there are other communities that are on the margins of the economy where single mothers are working 2 jobs to try and earn enough income to feed their family and struggling. And so the government has tried to address the issues around child poverty, around poor mental health, about expanding the capabilities of the Indigenous Maori people of New Zealand to participate fully in the economy. And it's a journey. I wouldn't say that we have solved everything just by this commitment to well-being economy and well-being budgets. But I think we are moving in a direction that is a better pathway than we have been for the last 30 years.
I mean, that's huge, really huge that you don't explore for oil now. What is your situation in New Zealand as far as oil exploration is concerned? Is your oil, is it nationalised, or did you have to say no to private companies?
It's saying no to private companies. So let's not exaggerate. The companies that have licenses now are still operating those licenses, but the government has stopped issuing new licenses. Now, most of the oil and gas is offshore of a particular part of the country, and that province, Taranaki, has built its economy around energy. And so the government has initiated a program that it's calling Just Transitions, where it's saying it's all very well for us as a country to express our commitment to the Paris Agreement in this way, But what are we doing as a country to ensure that the full impact of that is not being borne by just Taranaki? And this is different. In the past, it would have been a change of direction, and now we leave it up to the private sector to do the best they can. Now the government is trying to engage in a partnership with local communities to find better pathways forward.
That's fantastic news, and particularly relevant for me as I live in Aberdeen in Scotland, which is in a similar situation. Yeah.
That's a similar process to our government as well, which is, has a Just Transition Commission and is fully embedding just transition into the economic transformation of the country. So that's a similarity. I would like to pick up on some other similarities as we get a little bit more in depth to the New Zealand economy. New Zealand and Scotland have got almost round about the same population, just hovers around just above 5 million. But New Zealand's 3 or 4 times the size of Scotland. So kind of the similarities on that end there. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about what drives the New Zealand economy, main exports, how the economy operates in terms of trade?
Yes, so we have a lot of space. I mean, you've made that point, per person. And a third of the country is in the National Conservation Estate. So it's set aside for recreation and scientific and conservation purposes. Our history economically really began with the discovery of refrigerated shipping, and we became the UK's farm. So we would grow lamb and then beef and dairy products, wool originally, but that's phased out over the years. And during the 2 world wars, we would supply all that we could produce to Britain as part of our contribution to the war effort. And we built up a prosperous economy under that regime. And in fact, the place where I work in New Zealand, the AERU, the Agribusiness and Economics Research Unit, was founded by the government when the UK started to move towards Europe. And it became obvious that we would have to diversify. And we have diversified, but still 3/4 of our merchandise exports is food and fibre products. And that's been our strong comparative advantage. We're quite unusual in the OECD family of rich countries because so much of our economy still depends on the food and fibre sector. Now, we're a long way away from the rest of the world, and that's why refrigerated shipping was so important to us. It's an advantage, so we don't have to worry about acid rain or, we're a nuclear-free country, so there are strong advantages in being distant from some of the major population centres, but it means that manufacturing isn't very important to us. We're not manufacturing cars, for example. And so the other part of our economy is around the knowledge economy. So creating new software, providing business services overnight to companies and governments in Europe and North America. And so those 2 aspects, the land-based industries and the knowledge-based industries, they are the drivers of the local economy.
I'm really interested to get an idea of when and how quickly the New Zealand economy was able to transition from being heavily dependent on Great Britain to moving towards servicing the rest of the globe. Was that a very gradual process, or did that happen quite quickly?
Well, we started early. So Britain didn't go into Europe until the 1st of January 1973. And our research centre was founded in 1962. So we're just coming up to our 60th birthday. There's a big party next month. You're welcome. Any of your listeners find themselves in New Zealand, come and celebrate with us. And so 1962 to 1972, that's a decade of preparation, and we were starting to diversify not just our markets, but our products. So started thinking about venison. Kiwi fruit now is a huge export from New Zealand that nobody was thinking about in the 1970s.
I'm one of the big buyers there.
Yeah, oh, great. Yeah, no, it's a wonderful product. But by 1984, the perception was okay, we've done quite a bit in the last 20 years, but we are falling behind the OECD average. And so we introduced a program of economic reforms that tried to internationalize the New Zealand economy to make us more responsive to international prices.
Was this falling behind in terms of GDP growth or trade?
Exactly that. GDP per capita. Yes. Traditional economic growth means producing more, more cows, more milk, more exports. And the view was that the government had tried to cushion the blow of Britain going into Europe. So it had subsidized agricultural production. And so we were continuing to produce more, but we weren't selling more. And we were responding to government regulation rather than to market signals. And what happened is the economy split into two. So the people who were well placed to take advantage of the liberalization of the economy, including the companies, have done really well. But unemployment increased from 4% to 10%, and the Indigenous unemployment rate, Māori unemployment rate, went up to 25%. Now, 25% was what unemployment was at the height of the Great Depression. So this is my grandfather and my father's story happening in my own lifetime to Indigenous communities around the country. It's a typical J curve. So we stopped assembling cars, we stopped light manufacturing, and economically, there was no way we could justify continuing those subsidized industries. But it meant that we threw a whole lot of people whose only skills were in those industries onto the labour market. We reduced benefits at the same time, so people were desperate for work. And so we created a pathway where the economy created this huge number of low-skilled, low-wage jobs, and that is the legacy we still have. So this is why we have child poverty so high at the moment, is because if you had been in the freezing works for export, or in a car assembly plant, or assembling TVs for the local market, you were earning good income to support a family. A month later, you had no income support and you had to accept any job that was going. And so that meant low-skilled jobs that didn't pay a living wage, just paid the minimum wage. And so the children who were born in the 1980s are now the parents today, and now the grandparents today, who grew up with very little in the way of material resources, didn't complete advanced education. Their children often didn't advance in education. We have in New Zealand what we call a long tail. This is the people who emerge from school with very few qualifications. And in fact, really all they have learnt before they were allowed to leave school was how to be present in an institution without actively engaging in the institution. And so they take that into the workplace. And so you have employers saying, no, these people have no skills, but they don't really want to be here. Well, yes, that's what we've spent the last 12 months teaching them to do by giving them compulsory education, but wasn't really suited to developing skills that match the job opportunities that exist in local markets.
And that really highlights the need for a just transition this time round, when you're decarbonising the economy, because, you know, as you said, with the area that's relying on energy, but the whole economy has to decarbonise, and we have to move people towards other areas that are having a less an impact on the climate and on the environment. So it's really important that we do that in a strategic manner, which is similar in the UK, wasn't done in the early 80s when we moved away from manufacturing and from coal. It was just left to the private services, and most people would agree that that was a significant mistake that was made.
That's absolutely the language that the government is using. And in the agricultural sector, there has been a large growth in dairy farming, particularly in a couple of places around the country, in the South Island of New Zealand, and we weren't ready for it. And so that means that the waterways are being damaged by the dairy farms, and people have invested millions of dollars in milk processing and milking facilities on farms. And now we are looking at, well, what do we do with the nitrates that are leaching into the waterways and are damaging the waterways? And we've got 30 years of that accumulating. If we don't do something now, it's going to continue to grow for another 30 years. So what is the legacy we are leaving for our children? And how can government partner with producers to find a pathway that is a just transition to a better future?
Could I extend on that in terms of the impact that these types of industries, agriculture, is doing to New Zealand in terms of its soil and its environment? Because, obviously cows, pigs, lamb, they're not indigenous to New Zealand. They were transplanted there, mainly because the Brits were used to growing them in the United Kingdom. But they must have caused huge problems with the amount of grazing and also the dairy and all the processes that go into managing and growing these animals. Is this having a significant impact on the environment in New Zealand, or is it just because it's so big that it can cope with it?
Yes, did I mention that we have a lot of space in New Zealand, and we've set aside 1/3 of the land for the conservation estate. So 20 years ago, the big industries in the land-based sector would say, we've set aside 30% of our land for conservation purposes. We don't have to worry about conservation on the productive landscape, which is quite different from the UK, as I understand it, where, you think about biodiversity and hedgerows and wildlife corridors and so on. This has come to New Zealand relatively recently, only in the last 10, 15, 20 years at the most. But the change has come not just from an awakening within New Zealand about the damage that is taking place, but our consumers and customers in international markets are starting to ask questions about how is this food produced? And customers are saying, I don't want to buy food that is contributing to global climate change, that is damaging waterways, that is excluding local people from being able to buy food security in their own country. And so more and more New Zealand exporters are being called to account by their consumers to tell the story about what's happening in New Zealand. And we've got some good stories to tell. I wouldn't want you to think that, it's a horrible place to live in New Zealand. It's not. There's wonderful things about the natural environment. And we are more and more conscious of the damage that has been done and making change. And we want to tell that story now to the world as part of our contribution to the wellbeing economy movement.
That's really a growing thing in the Western world, is that inquiry into provenance of food.
Yes.
That's certainly changed during my lifetime as well. And I think your story about the milk industry expanding too quickly without thought demonstrates how economies are complex systems that need constant monitoring and long-term thinking responses as well. I mean, another thing that I discovered this morning, and I kind of knew this, but this was an academic on Radio Scotland this morning, is that we have a big problem in Scotland, particularly within the United Kingdom, of population decline. And it's more marked in Scotland. And I was interested to know, is your population growing or is it declining?
It's growing. Yes, it continues to grow. We have had a reasonably generous migration policy, particularly for skilled migrants, that the COVID-19 pandemic has interrupted. And there are producers now who are struggling with labour. So traditionally we have had schemes where workers would come from the Pacific Islands for the harvest season, and they would be welcome and would send remittances back home. It was a win-win situation by and large. Some of the skilled jobs in agriculture, there were dairy farmers and managers and workers from, say, the Philippines coming to New Zealand, and that was an important part of the agricultural workforce. And so at the moment, we are just relaxing the constraints at the border, and we are expecting to be able to welcome more migrants to New Zealand in the future. But there are parts of New Zealand where the population decline as people move to the big cities means that there aren't the ratepayers to pay the rates to maintain the local infrastructure and roads and facilities, and even things like drinking water and wastewater. The government is having to think about involving the national government in managing some of those resources, because so many communities don't have the economic base in order to ensure that everybody has access to safe drinking water. And again, the economy is broken into two groups, between those wealthy regions that are saying, no, we're perfectly fine, leave us alone, you shouldn't be involved. And the poorer communities are saying, we don't have the human resources, yet alone the financial resources, to do these basic functions of local government. And so there needs to be some sort of realignment at the national level.
That's a really interesting comparator. I mean, we had a situation until Brexit that we had a lot of labour came over from the Eastern European countries to Scotland to help with our farming industries. And we are, we're struggling with labour demands. And I hear that all the time. Again, I listen to Radio Scotland usually every morning, people saying, I can't get this type of care from the National Health, this or that type of care. But we lost a lot of people to Brexit. And it's a big problem if we can't import people when our birth rates are going down.
Yes. There's another side to that coin, which is that I said earlier that we have this long tail of young people leaving compulsory education with no qualifications. And in a way, some of these migrant workers filled that gap. And so there is an opportunity now to realign our education system so that, the Americans called it no child left behind, but the principle that the biggest contribution to lifetime well-being is how well you do at school. And if we are not conscious of those who are struggling at school and not providing the extra resources to re-engage in education and ensure that they are spending their time at school in a way that will contribute to their lifetime well-being, then we have to pay the costs of that for generations to come. So this is something we have woken up to, I think, but it's hard to change systems at that national level. That's a big challenge.
Yeah. Just mentioned there about the need to increase investment and an understanding of the importance of education. I just wanted your views on how New Zealand is able to do that as an issuer of its own currency. And have you had any thoughts about how would it be able to do that if it wasn't an issue of its own currency? And let's say it shared a currency with Australia. What role does that play in the success of New Zealand, this ability to have and issue your own currency?
Yes, we do talk occasionally about setting up a joint currency with Australia, and there are two ways we could do that. We could simply adopt the Australian currency. There's nothing stopping us from doing that. Australia, to the best of my knowledge, have said that would be absolutely fine. Would be very happy for you to use Australian dollars and cents. And for a long time, the exchange rate was set at 1. Historically, they were effectively one currency. The alternative is to set up a new currency jointly managed between the two countries with some sort of agreement about fiscal constraints, a bit like the euro in Europe. And I think the general feeling has been that wouldn't cost us too much, but we don't see that the benefits are so great compared to other problems we have that we want to spend any time making that a priority. And the Australian economy and the New Zealand economy aren't exactly the same. So the Australian economy is much more natural resource extraction and sending minerals off to China compared to our land-based economy. So from time to time, it would be uncomfortable. On the other hand, it's that sort of diversity that sometimes makes a joint currency work well. I think we are reasonably comfortable in New Zealand that the central bank has done a good job in managing the COVID-19 outbreak. So because we had an independent central bank, we were able to adopt an independent fiscal policy. We implemented wage subsidies to keep people engaged with employment as they weren't able to leave the house to engage in work. That decision was accommodated by the central bank. My boss is on the Monetary Policy Committee, so I have to say she's done a great job along with her colleagues. So there's no real appetite in the political spectrum to join with Australia. Yeah. And you know, it's a bit like Canada and the United States, maybe Scotland, you know, you have your own banknotes. There's a sense of national identity in handing over currency that belongs to you. Although, to be honest, the last time anybody handed a banknote over in a shop, more and more, it's all card transactions these days. So who knows what's down the track.
But that's very interesting to hear from our perspective, because, you know, New Zealand's a similar population. It's very often compared to Scotland. You have your own currency, and there's no real significant demand for anyone to say, let's give up all of the levers and the power that we have from issuing your own currency. And you covered a little bit there, saying during the COVID pandemic, the central bank was able to release money into the economy to make sure everything was fine, and can continue to do that. And as I said at the start of that question, but it can also do that from infrastructure spending. It doesn't have to raise that money from taxes. It can either borrow or it can print money to be able to spend for the infrastructure spending. And I take it that's going to be a big concern as we move into the climate crisis, that, you know, your government has to spend to make sure that New Zealand plays its part in the climate crisis and for the just transition and reducing poverty.
So they are at arm's length, the two authorities. So the government issues the wellbeing budget each year, which includes its debt program, and the central bank then makes its decisions independently about whether it will buy any of that debt. And it has a statutory responsibility to maintain price stability, but having regard to employment and stability in the exchange rate and the like. So I don't know that I would say it's crucial, because I don't think that the Minister of Finance would ever ring up the Governor of the Reserve Bank. I mean, he's not allowed to say, if I invested this extra money in infrastructure, can I have your assurance that you would buy some of the debt? That's not part of the New Zealand system at all. But if the Minister of Finance had to think, if I invested in education or invested in physical infrastructure or invested in just transactions, do I have to worry that in Canberra, in Australia, the Joint Monetary Authority, worried about the impact of inflation in Australia because of huge demand in minerals from China, might raise interest rates, just as I'm wanting to issue more debt? Then that could be a barrier to government action.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And this is why, as far as William and I are concerned, and many others, we need fiscal independence in Scotland to give us that political independence. Because although, you know, we are joined to England, it has a completely different economy and a completely different type of politics as well. You know, our geography is quite different, and our issues are quite different. And as I said earlier on, you know, we are losing our population at a faster rate. And you might be surprised to know at the time of the Act of Union, we were 20% of the UK population. We're now 8% of the UK population.
Right. Yes. Well, it's because your best people came to New Zealand.
Of course, that's it.
Can't argue with you there. I'd like to know a wee bit more about your view of the way that the economy's run in New Zealand. I mean, you're an OECD member. Would you describe the economy as traditionally neoliberal, or do you think it's slightly different from what we have in the United Kingdom?
Right. So in 1984, New Zealand described its economy as Fortress New Zealand. So if you wanted to import goods from New Zealand, you had from overseas, you had to get a license from the government. If you earned foreign exchange, you were legally obliged to sell that to the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. So my father trained racehorses, was one of the things he did. He won a race in Australia, and a month later he got a letter from the Reserve Bank saying, "We noticed that you have won this prize. When are you bringing the money back to New Zealand? Because you're obliged to sell it to New Zealand, to the Reserve Bank." So we were described as the most tightly controlled economy in the OECD. The government elected that year was a centre-left government who leapfrogged the incumbents to take a position on the far right, and they became extremely neoliberal. And all of the economic reforms were to create a neoliberal economy. When they ran out of steam, the centre-right party leapfrogged again, and we went further to the right, and that was the benefit cuts and the change to our employment law so that trade unions were a pale reflection of what they had been. And that framework remains in place to the current day, really. There's been some modifications over the last 5 years, but fundamentally we are a neoliberal market economy where statute requires the government to have balanced books on average over time, where the governor of the Reserve Bank is required to prioritise price stability, where the focus of the Commerce Commission is around competitive markets. And one of the puzzles in the literature is, why is it that an economy that was so neoliberal hasn't had greater economic success? And in a way, we are a lesson, I think, that theory has its place, but adherence to that theory isn't enough to achieve well-being. And we are starting to refocus our efforts to what I think was what Adam Smith was writing about all those years ago in 1776, about, you know, that well-being is about people having the capability to lead lives that they value. And so the proof of the pudding is in those communities. Are people able to lead good lives? And if they're not, then the economy is not working, it's not doing its job, and there is more work to be done. And there's more and more writing in New Zealand now recognizing that some of our problems about child poverty, about community exclusion, the seeds of those problems were sown in our reforms of the 1980s. And so we've got to go back to first principles and think about investing in education of young people, about making the most of the environment, targeting market segments that value the way we produce our food, not just the food and fiber that we produce. And investing more in creating and using knowledge that fits our local economy, rather than seeing ourselves as, you know, universities contributing to the international literature because of the kudos that brings to science, without at the same time reflecting the interests of the taxpayers who are paying our salaries.
I think also as well that governments in all countries should be considering their worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario has come along for Ukraine. And in Ukraine, they are being attacked by a much larger neighbour. Now, if you are in that worst case scenario, do you want a population that is healthy and educated or not? It's very simple to me. Surely most governments should see that that has to be their function, is to ensure that they have that in their countries, their respective countries.
Yes, and even in the best case scenario, you know, if you're leading a good life as a nation without having to worry about your neighbours, you still want people to be educated and healthy and leading good lives. And in a way, that's what I associate with Scotland. You know, you have your own education system, as I understand it, and you know the value of people learning what they are good at, and then discovering what they are good at, disciplining those abilities, and then being able to display those abilities in meaningful work. And that's at the heart of the wellbeing economy. And if communities are excluded from that process, then we as a country have a responsibility to apply our collective intelligence and financial resources to address that issue.
I agree. Two points I'd like to pick up on there, Paul. The first one is I would certainly agree with you that the seeds were sown for the problems that we have now with this onset of the neoliberal age and the rising inequality, but also the damage to our natural environment has been accelerated by the march of capitalism into natural capital and doing all the damage there. So I think that you said it's in the literature, but I think that's going to be much more obvious to people over the next 5-10 years, the damage that this neoliberal approach has done. And the second thing I wanted to say was this idea of the Scottish economy, and I think big bit of credit to go to the Scottish government is how they've tried to develop a very broad economy. Their latest research, their latest white paper has focused on several industries which are doing well, but they also want to concentrate on growth industries that should be doing well. And I think this is really, really to their testament and to be doing that. And it's they're doing that. They're doing this without the ability to invest Scotland's currency because they do have to work to this fiscal constraint that they have.
And that's what the neoliberal vision has really encouraged, I think. And so we see, farmers being incredibly wealthy, and their waterways are turning to yuck. And so but then you see other farmers who are as worried as I am about the environmental consequences and are desperate to find scientific and financial solutions where they can produce food and fiber for the world in a way that respects the local environment. And that's my day job at the moment, is working with people who share that vision of this is what it means to create value, not just in financial terms, but in environmental, social, cultural terms, by bringing together resources in a way that respects the environmental and planetary boundaries.
I think that your group are going to have a lot to teach us by the sounds of it. It sounds great. I'm really interested in this. I've just been allotted onto a board that's Northeast Agriculture. So I'll be watching carefully what you have to say. Yeah.
Well, before we let you go, I was just keen to get your view and opinion on Scotland's economy. And the Scottish government often says we'd like to be a little bit more like New Zealand. Is that kind of reciprocated? Is there things that New Zealanders see in the Scottish economy that they quite like, or Scottish society? And then finally, kind of, what's your view of Scotland within the United Kingdom and how that relationship works?
So Scotland and New Zealand were both founding members of the Wellbeing Economy Government Partnership. And I think at the top level, there was mutual respect for adopting a vision around well-being and the expectation that the two leaders would learn from each other on what is a new journey for everybody. I think that comment you made about similar sized populations and this wonderful natural environment that's so much a part of our heritage, I think that brings us close together. We're always competing on the rugby field from time to time. I don't know so much about the detail of Scottish policy, but the wellbeing economy framework, with its visual representation of the breadth of indicators that make up the wellbeing vision, that really resonated in New Zealand. And I think in New Zealand, we tend to think, I hope this doesn't offend anybody, we tend to think of Scotland and Wales in the same sentence. And, the Welsh have got their Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and Commissioner, and Scotland's got this wellbeing vision. And the thought in New Zealand was, that's us, that's what we're trying to do. And so small economies that are revisiting fundamental principles about how to design an economy to deliver well-being that respects planetary boundaries and includes everybody, we're a family. aren't we? These small countries, and Scotland and New Zealand are certainly members of that family.
Yeah,
and that's why we've invited you onto the Small Nation series to talk about New Zealand. Paul, that's been really interesting with us. Thanks so much for that overview, and best of luck with all your work. It sounds fascinating and really valuable.
Well, thank you very much for your hospitality. I've enjoyed this talk.
Thank you so much. So interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Bye now.
Bye.